Hi, I'm Pastor Michael Schmidt. Welcome to Bible Study. We are continuing our Bible study of the story of Samson, as found in Judges chapter 13 through 16. I encourage you that send me your favorite Bible stories or Bible characters, and we will cover them in a future Bible study. We will continue with Samson through the end of September, so we have today and then 2 more weeks after today with Samson. But then starting in October, we'll be relying on you to tell me your favorite characters, your favorite stories, and we will study them in depth. Some maybe only for a week or 2. Others, depending on which ones you pick, we might look at them a bit longer. But definitely let me know who your favorites are, and we'll cover them. Well, today we are continuing with Samson, and we are in the book of Judges, chapter 15. Chapter 15 follows immediately with the events of chapter 14. If you remember, at the conclusion of chapter 14, Samson has posed this riddle to the wedding party, the groomsmen that are to entertain him or be with him before the wedding to the Philistine woman. And he poses this riddle to them. They cannot, of course, figure out the riddle, so they convince his bride, his wife, or future wife. That's a bit of a confusion there, so we'll kind of dive into that in chapter 15. But they convince her to go to Samson and pester him for the answer to this riddle. And so they go and she pesters him, and he gives her, and finally, after 7 days, he finally gives her the right answer. And then they come and they answer the riddle for him. And they answer the riddle, and then Samson gets mad. He goes to Ashkelon, and he strikes down 30 men and brings back their garments, their clothes, as the reward for solving the riddle. But in order to provide them, he doesn't go to the store and buy them new suits or anything. He just goes and kills 30 Philistines, their fellow countrymen, and he comes back and then gives them the garments as their reward for answering the riddle. So that's kind of the backstory, and that sets us up for chapter 15. So, one more thing on chapter 14. Samson goes in chapter 14, verse 19. Samson is very angry that they have solved this riddle, that his future wife, bride, we'll get to that in a minute again, has tricked him and provided the answer. And he's very angry, and he leaves very angry, and he goes home. Goes back to his father's house. Doesn't really say goodbye, doesn't really close off loose ends, doesn't take the woman with him. He just goes home. And so chapter 14 ends in verse 20. Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. And again, this is just sort of a best man that was pulled off the street to accommodate Samson, because none of the Israelites would come down to this mixed marriage between Israelite Samson and this Philistine woman. So she just sort of gives her to the best man, who Samson probably never met before in his life. But that's the conclusion of chapter 14. That does set us up now for chapter 15. Because chapter 15, verse 1, it's wheat harvest, which in this particular time, sort of similar to our time, is May or June time of year. Similar to here, it's late May, early June when harvest begins, or people start thinking about harvest, but that's kind of the time of year it is here in chapter 15. Samson goes down to visit his wife. This is kind of a standard practice here. It wasn't necessarily the practice that you got married and immediately took your wife home with you. You kind of got married and then your wife stayed in her parents' home for a while. And again, if you consider that this is a time of younger marriages, We may still be dealing with some disputes over the contract of how this is going to be arranged, or it may be along the lines that, the groom, in this case Samson, hasn't really established himself yet, is still working to establish a home, establish a business, and he cannot afford the wife. So he's sort of put all this money into acquiring the wife, and now he needs to rebuild his finances in order that he might provide for the wife. So it's not unusual at all that, husband and wife, at least for an initial period of time, would not live with each other. They would have rights, all the marriage rights of being together as husband and wife, but they would not share a house. They wouldn't share an address yet. So they have consummated the marriage. They have fulfilled the marriage. They are acting as married people, with the exception that they are not living together. So Samson goes and visits her. And he says, I will go to my wife in the chamber. So obviously he is intending that they are going to have husband-wife sexual relations here in verse 1. But her father would not allow it. He stops Samson and says, you can't go in there. And verse 2, the father says, I really thought you hated her, and so I gave her to your best man. That's not an absurd opinion right there. Samson left in very angry terms. It wasn't a pleasant departure. Samson was furious. He killed 30 Philistines to sort of fulfill off the bet of this riddle. Though his bride was very much integral into their solving the riddle. It is not out of the question that Samson never wants to see her again. But then the father has this problem of he has this daughter that was pledged to be married, that was almost married, that might have been married, and then all of a sudden is left at the altar. We kind of see this back in Genesis with Jacob and Laban. Laban, of course, tricks Jacob into marrying Leah when he really wanted Rachel. And his rationale for that is, well, you can't let the second daughter marry first, because then everyone's going to say, well, what's wrong with the first daughter? We don't want to marry her. So a stigma develops around that first daughter. That's Laban's argument in Genesis. That's the father's argument here, is that, my daughter just got left at the altar. Rumors are going to spread like wildfire about her, and then she'll never get married. So essentially, he kind of gives her to the first person that he sees, who happens to be the best man. Or maybe even that's the best man's job, is, the groom falls down, the best man, everybody moves one step over, and the best man takes the spot of the groom. So it's not an out of the question idea here for him to give the bride to the best man because he thought Samson was never coming back, because that's a very logical assumption right there, is that Samson is never coming back based on the circumstances of which Samson left. Now, here's the tricky question. Were Samson and this Philistine woman, who's very odd she's never named, she's just sort of the woman, the Philistine woman, were they actually married? Were they married? Now, this is biblical time, so the state is not involved at all. It's not like they went to the courthouse, got a marriage license, and then it was signed and properly notarized and filed away and recorded. We don't see that here. They don't do that in biblical times. What we see here is that it was just kind of the witnesses said it happened. The families agreed to the arrangement. The minister said, I now pronounce you husband and wife. So there's kind of the question there is, are they married? Samson obviously thinks they are. So, and that's probably the Israelite tradition, is that they have completed the steps to the point where they are married. So, according to the Israelite tradition, the answer is likely yes, they are married. Samson has married this Philistine woman. The marriage is complete. It is whole. The Philistine tradition may very well say they're not married. Maybe the marriage wasn't consummated. Maybe they didn't officially finish off the final step. Maybe he left and the father just said they're divorced, where in the Israelite tradition you can't do that. So there is a legitimate question here, is are they married? And we have opposing answers. Samson says, yes, we're married. We did everything we needed to do. The Philistines say, no, you're not married. You haven't done everything you need to do. And again, this goes back to what we discussed last week with competing traditions, with competing faith traditions. Are you married? Now today, because of the state and state's role in marriage, we don't necessarily come to that question of are you married, yes or no, because the state kind of steps in and finalizes it. Although you could say Mormons, with their idea of celestial marriages and polygamous marriages, which are not recognized by the state, are sort of skirting around that. But again, we have this question of religious traditions. Are you married? How do you go about marriage? What constitutes marriage? In the church, many faithful people think the marriage is solidified, is official because it was done in the house of God. God's word has been added to this marriage and it has been solidified. In a more secular opinion, the marriage might be solidified or might be official when you have the big bash. There's the big blowout, the big celebration, the big party. And so what do we see right now in our particular situation that we are living through with COVID is that a lot of marriages are being postponed or put off because they can't do the big celebration. They cannot find the banquet hall or the catering hall or the party hall or the caterer or the DJ or any of that stuff that will fill their wedding, that will do the job because of the COVID. And so the weddings are being postponed. They're being postponed indefinitely in some cases because we don't know when this is going to end. And so what makes the marriage? Well, in those cases, the celebration makes the marriage. You can get married, and all you need are the bride, the groom, a minister, and 2 witnesses. So conceivably 5 people are all you need to get married. And some places you might not even need that many. You definitely need the bride and groom, and you need someone to officiate. You may not need witnesses, depending on where you are. So we have this question of what makes the marriage here in Samson, and there's a dispute. Now, in good and proper American terms, they would go to court and they would fight this out. That's not necessarily what they do here. So finishing off verse 2, the father tries to appease Samson. He says, you can't have her anymore because I gave her to your best man. But isn't her younger sister more beautiful? Take her instead. Isn't that what you want to hear when you're the child? Is, hey, I got the first one married off. The second one's far more pretty. She'll be married off in an instant. It's kind of back in Genesis when the crowds are at the door. They're trying to storm down and get into Lot's house and take the messengers of the Lord. Lot offers up his daughters. So isn't that what you want to hear when you're the daughters, someone's child, is, hey, they're trying to get in to rape these 2 guys. Why don't you rape my daughters instead so I can protect my guests? Very different mindset, very different thinking here. So verse 3, Samson says, "Then I shall be innocent of the blood of the Philistines in this case." So the last time, chapter 14, that was really hot anger, and he acted inappropriately there. It's kind of an admission there. Now he's saying, "You've wronged me. Now I'm innocent. Now whatever I do to you, I'm justified because of your actions against me. You gave away my wife. How dare you? I'm so angry now. Now my anger is justified." Verse 4, this is kind of one of Samson's, there are kind of three instances with Samson that you really think about when you think of the examples of his strength. Chapter 14, we had him tearing apart the lion. Chapter 15, we have the foxes here. And then chapter 16, of course, is his death, where he tears down the temple of the Philistines. So he takes 3,000 foxes, ties them together, and then puts torches between their tail. Ties them together, puts torches on their tails, and then he sends them into the grain. Some of it's standing in the fields. Again, this is harvest time, so some still in the fields, hasn't been cut down. Some of it's over here and it's piled up, but it's dried out. It's very flammable. So he takes the foxes and he sets them loose in the grain. And 300 foxes, they're going to set up a lot of fires and they're going to burn a lot of grain. And he does this to avenge the Philistines, avenge this man in particular who has taken his wife and given her away. So he sends them in. They burn all the grain as well as the olive orchards, verse 5. The Philistines, understandably, are very angry in verse 6. Who's done this? Samson, the son-in-law of the Timite. So it's interesting. The father questions the marriage, so much so that he gives the bride away to the best man. But here, the people, the Philistines, recognize the marriage, referring to Samson as the son-in-law of the Timite. So they recognize the marriage. And they accuse the father of the woman. He has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So they recognize what happened. Now maybe they are only saying this because they need a scapegoat, which we're going to see here in a minute why that's important. Well, let's just look at it. So it's the second half of verse 6 there. The Philistines came up and burned her with her father with fire. They burned the father and they burned the daughter. Which, incidentally, is the threat the Philistines make against them, against the daughter, back in chapter 14, where they beg her, or trying to get her to get the answer to the riddle so Samson doesn't embarrass them. They want her to get the riddle, and if she doesn't find the answer to the riddle, they're going to burn her. Well, here in chapter 15, now they're mad again, and they burn her anyway. So we see here is that the Philistines are obviously they're put here in a bad light. They're put here as the opposite of God's people. They do not value life. They don't value the life of this woman or her family because they're constantly threatening, and now they are finally enacting murder upon her. They have no outlet for their rage. The real problem here is they look at Samson and his strength, and they realize they cannot defeat Samson. They cannot fight Samson. If they try, he will kill them. And he won't even break a sweat. So we can't kill Samson. Let's kill the father and daughter instead. So they are releasing their anger against others because they cannot get at Samson. Verse 7, Samson says, "If this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit." So again, he's angry because they burned his wife. The wife the father wouldn't let her have, the wife that everyone thought he had left anyway, he's now mad that they just burned his wife. He picks up verse 8, he picks up something on the ground, and he strikes and hit the thigh, so he sort of breaks them apart. He hits these Philistines so hard and so strongly that they're left in pieces. He sort of comes down upon them so hard that they're smashed to pieces. So hip and thigh, they're just tossed aside. So we kind of have a tit for tat here. Samson, Samson loses his wife, so he takes the foxes, ties them up, and burns the grain. The Philistines are then mad, so to get back at Samson, they burn his wife and her father. Samson is mad now, so he gets back at them by taking some object and tearing them apart, striking them, leaving them in just a pile of body parts strewn around. So now it's the Philistines' turn. What are they going to do? Well, verse 9. The Philistines, again, they cannot defeat Samson, so who do they attack now? Verse 10, Judah. They attack the people of Samson's people, Samson's kin. The people. The people of Judah, of course, don't understand this. They say, why have you come up against us? And they say, we're looking for Samson. Give us Samson, we'll leave you alone. Verse 11, 3,000 men of Judah go to Samson, who's hiding in some rocks. It's kind of a rocky area right there. It says he's hiding in the cleft of the rock. The cleft of the rock, so there's some caves in that area of where this is possibly happening. There's some caves. There's also some rocky ground. In some places, the rocks are so close together, only one man can pass through at a time. So it's possible Samson's just sort of in that area. He's in those rocks. And that's where he's hiding or resting or whatever he's doing. So the Philistines come and they say to the men of Judah, give us Samson and we'll spare you. The men of Judah go and get Samson, which points to the kind of the unfaithfulness of Israel. They don't realize or don't see what God is doing through Samson, that he is fighting the Philistines on their behalf, and that it is to their benefit that Samson fights the Philistines and destroys them. The people of Judah, in particular, people of Judah is where we are, they see that they only see what is before them, which is the Philistines who are ruling over them. And that as long as they keep things quiet, the Philistines won't bother them. Very similar to what we see in the Gospels. What is the Jews' main concern? It's really the Romans. They don't want the Romans to come down and bother them. They want the Romans to leave and get out of the way. But ultimately, they also don't want the Romans to come and bother them. So if they keep Rome happy, or at least content, or out of their hair, they'll be good enough with that. And yet Jesus comes and he's kind of overthrowing the establishment, the established religion and the established government. He's kind of calling all this into question. And this makes the Jews very nervous. What is Jesus doing? Why is he doing this and trying to cause trouble where there is none? So that is what they don't realize that Jesus has come to establish a new kingdom. They only want what is before them, which is the current kingdom, which is their own kingdom, not the greater kingdom that Jesus brings. So here it's like the men of Judah are willing to do the work of the Philistines because the Philistines are ruling over them. They don't see what Samson has promised, or what good Samson brings them. So So they say, we have come down to bind you, that you can give you into the hands of the Philistines. Samson says, well, don't attack me yourselves. They say, no, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We won't kill you. And they tie him up and they bring him back. Samson lets them tie him up and bring him back. They come back to Lehi, which incidentally means jawbone, which we'll see here further in a moment why that's sort of ironic. The Philistines rejoice that the men of Judah have brought them Samson. They see he is bound, so they're excited about that. The hard part's done. Now they just have to take him back to their capital. And all of a sudden, the Spirit of the Lord fills Samson. And he breaks the bonds, picks up a jawbone of a donkey, and he strikes down the Philistines again. And he strikes down 1,000 men. And then as soon as he's finished striking them down, he takes the jawbone and just sort of flips it away. Doesn't need it anymore. Kind of if you've seen episode 3 of Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi kills General Grievous with the blaster, and then as soon as General Grievous is dead, Obi-Wan sort of walks away and he takes the blaster and he just sort of flips it away. It says, so uncivilized. You can almost picture Samson doing that. He takes the jawbone, he strikes down the Philistines, then he says, throws it away. Obi-Wan Kenobi walks away completely without weapons, unarmed, and so does Samson. He walks away without the jawbone. He walks away without this weapon that was just in his hand that he used to strike down the Philistines. And he just sort of flicks it away and says, how uncivilized. And he walks away nonchalantly. Verse 18, kind of finishing off the chapter here. He gets thirsty. Works up a sweat, killing all those Philistines. He gets thirsty, and he says, God, where's the water? Why haven't you given me any water? I'm thirsty. Give me something to drink. And you kind of get the impression here that almost God is scared of Samson. Or Samson's the cool kid that everyone wants to be around, and all he has to do is say something and someone just immediately grants it. God doesn't really call for a faithful confession here or anything. He doesn't speak to Samson and say, well done, good and faithful servant. God just sort of opens up a rock and water comes out and Samson is refreshed and his spirit returns. Just sort of, even God is cool with what Samson did. God approves of what Samson did. The Philistines are the enemy of God's people, and God approves of Samson's attacks and destruction that he brings against the Philistines. And kind of backing up back to those 3,000 men that come to bind Samson and bring him back to the Philistines, Samson's really a one-man show. The men of Judah just completely, the Philistines say, bring us Samson. The men of Judah just say, okay, no questions asked. They don't even put up a fight. There's no record here that the men of Judah take up their weapons and chase after the Philistines with them, with Samson, and strike down even more Philistines and sort of fight back even more. Samson's kind of a one-man wrecking band here. And kind of, if you think about Samson, you almost think in the sense of kind of like terrorism today. Samson doesn't have an army. Samson is working alone. Samson is sort of acting by himself, with no one's authority and with no one's help. So he's kind of acting in a terroristic mindset. Not the suicide terrorist where he's going to kill himself, but the terrorist, guerrilla warfare, terrorist mindset where, if Samson's in the area, there's going to be trouble. If Samson's not in the area, then Judah, Israel, they're not going to raise a finger to stop the Philistines from doing whatever they want. And that's kind of what Samson is up against. You know, if you think back to Gideon, if you think back to Deborah in the book of Judges, they have armies. Now Gideon, God whittles down the army and makes it a much smaller army, but he still has an army. They're still at the end, there's still the 300 mighty men of Gideon that go out against the forces. With Samson, he's by himself. So Samson really falls into that terrorist mindset where he's just sort of operating as this lone wolf, that every now and then Samson comes around, makes a big mess, strikes down a bunch of Philistines, and then he leaves and goes and does his own thing. Also, that God grants him water shows that Samson does have faithful moments. There's a lot of unfaithful moments with Samson, particularly in his choice of women. But there are also faithful moments, that he is doing this. He doesn't fight against God's people. He's only fighting against the Philistines, the ones who are wreaking havoc on God's people. So Samson is very much a one-man show. Kind of when you're strong and big and burly like that, you don't need an army to help you. But at the same time, you know, it would be nice if Israel, Judah, showed some faith and they stepped up and they also fought the Philistines along with Samson. But for right now, it's just Samson doing this. Now later, when Samuel comes along, and then the people ask for a king, and then of course you remember in 1 Samuel, David kills Goliath. As soon as he strikes down Goliath and chops off his head, then all Israel runs after the Philistines and pursues them into the hill country, fighting against the Philistines and striking down a great number of them. But today there's just one, and it's just Samson. The chapter closes off, verse 20, and Samson judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So this is kind of a 20-year deal of Samson wreaking havoc on the Philistines. That when Samson's around, the Philistines suffer. Samson's not around, the Philistines have their way with Israel. Well, send me your thoughts or comments, questions, if you have any, about Samson. And then also send me those favorite characters, those favorite stories, and we will pick them up in a future Bible study as we make our way through here. So may the Lord bless the rest of your day, and thanks for watching. Have a good day.